You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. In C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, he says the church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they're not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. This idea that the point of the church is to make disciples is, at its core, not a highly contested one. But ideas about the way disciples are made and the context in which discipleship happens are much more varied. And in these conversations, the question of a church's size looms large. On the one hand, you have the small church. It can be anywhere from just a handful of members to a few hundred. But in any case, there is a much greater likelihood for congregants to build personal relationships with those leading the church. There's a greater potential for a tight-knit community where everybody knows one another. And oftentimes, there's a wide variety of ages in attendance, with some congregants having attended for the bulk of their lives. Now, on the other hand, you have the large church. Maybe its attendance is in the upper hundreds, the thousands, or even the 10,000s. This substantial attendance often means the ability to acquire a large chunk of land and employ a staff of seasoned professionals for everything from worship leaders who sound like pop stars to trained baristas for their in-house cafes. And with these resources and this influence, there's a greater ability to quickly raise money for disaster relief or needs in the congregation. There may be more comfort for new believers to not feel like they're standing out in the crowd. And the culture might be one which more naturally attracts non-Christians. Criticism from one size of church to the other is not uncommon. The small churches will say congregants don't know their pastors at large churches. And the large churches will say that small churches aren't going to reach unbelievers. But what size is right for a church? Is there one at all? To find out, I spoke with Carl Vaders. Carl was a pastor for decades, and now he creates resources dedicated to helping small churches thrive. Back in 2024, Carl wrote a book called Desizing the Church, which investigates the way many churches pursued growth in attendance above all else, often to their detriment. Carl's book doesn't demonize church growth. It instead asks pastors and congregants to consider what it means to be a healthy Christian community without anchoring that health to merely the number of people in the pews. Here's Carl. I think just to start really, really basic, help me understand, in the most historical, interdenominational, bare bones sense, what is a church supposed to be? What is it supposed to look like? And then maybe how does size play into that? But really just what is it? What is a church?
Yeah, there are three essential elements to any healthy church. The Great Commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And then what often happens is churches do those two things and then can't understand why the people in the congregation aren't growing stronger in their faith, aren't getting more mature in their faith. And it's because we typically leave off the third essential element, which is discipleship. Ephesians 4, 11, and 12 is the only place in the Bible where the word pastor is mentioned, for instance. The apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, the fivefold ministry gifts. And in that one place, the only place where pastors are mentioned, first of all, pastors should be sharing the ministry leadership with those four other gifts. So we're never supposed to do that alone. Secondly, we're given one assignment. And it doesn't say pastors do all the ministry for the church. It said pastors equip God's people for works of service, which is discipleship. So when a church is healthy and functioning well, it is practicing the Great Commandment, the Great Commission, and it's doing discipleship where we're making disciples who become disciple makers. And if you remove any of those three elements, you can have a growing church, you can have a happy church, but you're not going to have an effective church the way Jesus designed his church to be.
No, yeah, that's very helpful. And, is there any particular instance or pattern that you noticed that really got you interested and got you burdened for writing a book about church size in particular?
Yeah, I tried to build a big church and failed. Yeah, I was one of the last graduating classes in the early 1980s that was trained to do pastoring under the old school way of pastoring, which was just care for your people. And like I went through Bible college in the late 70s and early 80s and never heard the term church growth, never had a conversation about church growth. There was no class or book about church growth. And within 5 years after I came out, by the mid 1980s, church growth was not just the dominant conversation. It was virtually the only conversation that pastors were having. And so I looked at that and thought, okay, there's something to this. And I started to study it, and I started to go to the conferences and read the books and saw a lot of great stuff that I loved and thought that's what I need to do. And I applied all of the church growth concepts as best I could, as prayerfully as I could, as honestly as I could, as fervently as I could. And it brought some benefits to the church, but it brought more burnout than benefits. And I found myself after 25 years in pastoral ministry, frustrated, burnt out, almost ready to leave ministry, not because the church wasn't good, not because the church wasn't having impact, not because the church wasn't healthy. It was doing all those things, but because it wasn't getting bigger like all the church growth principles said it should. The main principle at the time was healthy things grow. And the implication to that is if you're not growing, you're not healthy. So they look around at all the churches that weren't growing numerically that year, and they stuck them with the word, stuck. They called them stuck, or they called them broken, with no evidence other than the fact that they hadn't grown numerically year over year. They didn't look at any other factors almost any time. And I got caught up in that. And I looked around and realized, okay, there's something wrong here, and almost left ministry in frustration until I had a counselor who told me, Carl, you have to figure out how to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And when he said that to me, I said, I don't even know what that means. And he answered honestly. And he said, yeah, I don't know what it means either. But if we don't figure it out together, it sounds like it's going to kill a great church and take a wonderful pastor out of ministry. And so he and I worked on that. And ever since then, I've been on the relentless search to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. So that's how I got into this particular area of ministry. Yeah.
Yeah. And are you still pastoring?
No, I pastored for 40 years. I pastored the church that I'm currently serving. I pastored as the lead pastor for 25 years. And then at year 25, I handed the reins over to my youth pastor, who has now been pastoring for the last 7 years. I was on staff with him for 6 of those years, but in the last year and a half now, we have gone full-time into the ministry of helping small churches thrive.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. And so I'd love for you to kind of start breaking that down for me. What does it mean for a small church to thrive? Now that you've understood what maybe a successful church can look like when it's not getting massive, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, it's the 3 things we talked about. Are we practicing the Great Commandment? Is there a true love of God and love of people that's evident in the place? Secondly, the Great Commission. Are people getting saved? Are people getting baptized? Is there outreach into the community? And thirdly, discipleship. Are people actually getting trained up, and are they becoming disciple makers themselves? So as an example, in our congregation, we've spent the last 15 to 20 years. I came into a church 32 years ago that had like 25 discouraged people in the pews. They had 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. They had almost taken a vote to close the doors. And they said, let's bring in one more pastor and see if the Lord has something for us. And I was that pastor. So I came into this very discouraged church. And it took us 15 years or more to get it to a point where I really looked around and went, okay, this is a healthy, strong church right now. And then I went through some frustration because even though it was healthy, it wasn't growing numerically, until finally, after that time that I told you, where I'm trying to figure out how to define success without numbers attached to it, I started looking around and going, okay, if it's not about numbers, then how do I know my church is healthy? And I started asking questions like, is there a sense of the presence of God here? Yes. Are we teaching the Bible well? Yes. Are we training people up in discipleship? Yes. How do we know that? Well, as an example, 10 days ago in our church, we had another family couple, a husband and wife and family, come up on the platform to pray and commission to send them off to be full-time ministry at a church in another state. And part of the way that they got hired by that church was they showed up in our congregation 5 or 6 years ago, had come out of Bible college, but had gotten discouraged and didn't know what their calling was. And in the last 5 or 6 years, they became our first impressions leaders. They were the ones who welcomed new people, who started a new discipleship program for us, helped people connect with one another. Basically, the last 5 or 6 years, on the job training, they figured out how to do first impressions at a church well, in a church that was small enough to allow them to make those mistakes. They are now so good at it that a multi-site megachurch in another state has hired them full-time to oversee first impressions for all of their sites. So we can look at that and go, okay, so where is the growth for us? Well, it's not growth for us, it's growth for the kingdom of God. That's the third point. We're equipping God's people for works of ministry. And he got good at it, good enough at it that he could either stay with us and continue to do it and have to work a second job, or he can take a paying job where they're going to pay him to do that full time. But his training, they could not have trained him as thoroughly or as quickly as the training he got in our church, because he had to hit the ground running. He was learning it as he was doing it. And they can't afford to pay someone to learn it as they're doing it. So he couldn't have learned his stuff there, but we at our church couldn't pay him what they can. So each of us is contributing in different ways to the growth of the body of Christ.
Totally. Yeah, no, that's super cool. And I mean, as you're saying, these small churches can be really healthy and big churches can be really healthy. When you have pastors come to you and they say, hey, the church is very alive. We are discipling well. People are getting fed the gospel. We're seeing people come to Christ, but we're getting really big. And they want to understand if they need to, if they're literally outgrowing their building or whatever, do they need to build another building? Do they need to move spaces, or should they church plant? Should they divide? How do you help pastors work through that question of, do I keep expanding, keep growing right here, or do we just spread out what we're doing to other areas of the city?
Yeah. One of the great things that has changed in my 40 years in ministry is in the last 10 years, there has been a whole bunch of new tools added to the pastor toolbox. As far as what do we do when we're getting bigger, like you just said. As recently as 10 years ago, if you got bigger, you just had to build a bigger building, right? The idea, maybe you'd add a service or two, but the only thing that growth looked like was more people in this building at this time. And now we've got multi-site. And now we've got, church planting happened then, but there's been a real renewal and boom of church planting where you send some folks off to plant at your own church. You've got the micro church model where you can plant micro churches in coffee shops and in homes that are part of the oversight of a larger congregation. You've got big churches that come alongside struggling small churches and can make them one of their campuses and bring in the resources of the big church while keeping a whole lot of the DNA of that small church intact, so that the parts about that small church that are working get to continue, but the parts of the churches the small church that's struggling can be enhanced and can be strengthened by the big church coming alongside them. So if a church gets to the point where they are growing and they're getting larger, they then need to take a look at, okay, what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What is God calling us to do? What are the opportunities available? What are the needs in our community? And which model is the best way to do that, or a mix of models, or maybe coming up with a model nobody ever heard of before. My current episode of my podcast, The Church Lobby, is with Luke Simmons. And Luke's church is facing exactly your question. He's Ironwood Church in Mesa, Arizona. And they have just hit the 2,000 mark. So they've just become a mega church. And I didn't know him until I saw some of the stuff he was writing and liked it and wanted to talk to him about it. But I believe him when he says, yeah, we've been trying to grow. Yeah, we've been moving toward that, but we never aspired to mega status. So as soon as they hit mega church, they looked around and he said, I talked with the staff and we started thinking, how do we keep the intimacy, the closeness, the relationships? How do we not lose touch with the congregation members, particularly as a staff, when we're that big. So they've taken on an assignment that they'll be doing for the next year where their staff, full-time and part-time staff, are going to have one-on-one, face-to-face, in-person meetings with 1,000 church members in the next year. So if they're full-time staff, you've got to do a meeting a week. If you're part-time staff, you got to do a meeting a month. Then they'll get together, they share about the meetings they had, about the people they met, about the things that are happening, and see where that goes and see how that increases the relational closeness of the church and how it keeps the staff in touch with a church, even as it's getting very, very big. So this is something I'd never heard of before. He actually put it up on X, and I saw it there and I thought, that's fascinating. That's a whole new thing I'd never heard of before. I want to talk to him. So that's why he's the most current episode podcast on the church lobby, because he's doing something that I'd never heard done before. But to me, that's a wonderful example of a church that's not chasing after and not obsessing over size, but is adapting to the numerical increase that God is giving to them and trying to figure out how to do it in both a big and small way in the best way possible.
Yeah, so I think if I hear you correctly, you're saying it's not at all science yet, and the stuff that's working we're kind of still figuring out, and people need to be being creative about it. Basically, there's still a lot of room for innovation.
Yeah, I mean, it's an art and a science. There's some science to it, but part of the reason I wrote Desizing the Church was because we went through 40 years where we kind of leaned entirely on the science of it and kind of forgot that there's a God's will part of this that we always have to be open to and we always have to adapt to, and we haven't got it all quite figured out yet. And then in the last decade or so, and especially in the last 5 to 6 years post-COVID, where we're seeing dramatic departures from the church. You know, the book, The Great De-Churching, one of the best books written about the church in the last couple of years, which lays out the real challenge that we're facing as there are departures from the church that are at greater levels than we've ever seen in American history before. And why is that happening, and what's going on, and how do we adapt better to it? And because of that, we're having to put a pause on it and go, okay, maybe we haven't got it all figured out as much as we had. Because when you look at the stats, churches that have been following church growth principles have predominantly not found themselves reaching more unchurched people in their community. They find that their results is in more Christians gathered in the same spot. Or a shorter way of putting that is the church growth principles tend not to reach new converts, but tend to reach more other Christians. And I think Willow Creek was the first, mega church that really leaned into that. It's been 20, 25 years ago now that they did that study that, and they brought in an independent firm, and I'm trying to remember the name of it now. It's a well-known study. Anyway, they did the study, and their whole thing was, we're reaching the unchurched. We're a church for people who don't like church. And the study came back and said, nope, almost all of your growth has come from church people coming into your church. You're just gathering Christians into larger groups. So that's not church growth. That's Christian consolidation. Now, small churches aren't any better at doing that than big churches are. Okay. But we've got to stop praising the numerical increase when it's not conversion growth. We've got to accurately identify it. That's what it is. I'm not out to criticize. I'm out to be accurate. Let's accurately identify what's happening. And in most cases, when a church gets super big, let's accurately identify that it is almost entirely transfer growth and very, very little conversion growth. At least no higher a percentage of conversion growth than in an average healthy small church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of the big and the small church, because, I grew up in and currently attend a small church. It's always been, not tiny, but sub 300. And the attitude in the culture of those churches toward mega churches, but really toward anything bigger than probably 600, is that really they don't have any community, and they're kind of doing it wrong. It's kind of like this cheap, more hollow, shallow thing. And so I appreciate it about, I think I read it on your site or maybe an interview that you did, but you talked about you're not anti mega church, and you think there's plenty of room for there to be more really large churches? You think that they can do some really special things that small churches maybe can't, or just help people that small churches can't? Can you talk a little bit about, what are the advantages of having a really big church that meets every week versus the advantages of the small church?
Yeah. The primary and most obvious advantage of the big church is technical excellence. And there is an attraction to technical excellence that has become a baseline for our culture. So a generation ago, certainly 2 generations ago, the average church of 100 and a church of 500, about the only difference they had, if they were in the same denomination, was their size. They sang out of the same hymn book. They ran the same kids and men's and ministries program. They supported the same missionaries, and one had a bigger choir and one had a smaller choir, but there wasn't a real technical qualitative difference between them. Today, the technical qualitative difference between big and small is enormous. And that's one of the unintended byproducts of the rise of the mega and now the meta church. Once you get into the thousands and now you get into churches in the tens of thousands, you've got to be doing things at a level of organizational and technical excellence that churches simply didn't have to do before. So now there's this really big gap. But what happens is, one of the things I really appreciate about my megachurch friends is nobody is trademarking their ideas. When a large church pastor figures something out, they don't trademark it. They yell it to everybody as quickly as they can to say, look what we figured out and you can do it too. Right? They have a great generosity of spirit. They want to share their ideas as quickly as they can to as many people as possible so that all boats are lifted, so that the kingdom of God moves forward and not just their own congregation. So I have a huge appreciation for my megachurch friends for that. So megachurches are discovering new technical ways of doing things that wouldn't be discovered by small churches because they have the resources. Secondly, they're able to pay more pastor salaries than small churches are. The biggest trend growing right now in the small church is the rise of the bivocational and co-vocational pastor. We've got a lot of pastors. If you're pastoring a church of under 200, you better figure out how to have a second income or you're not going to survive. So if you want to get paid, you got to go to a bigger church. And if you want to amass resources quickly to help with large projects where there's an emergency or a problem or a disaster somewhere, the megachurch has the ability to amass resources really, really quickly. So these are just a handful of the advantages that the big church brings in that I'm profoundly grateful for.
Totally. And then could you also talk about the advantages on the other side of the small church? What does it bring to the table that the big church can't?
Yeah. Over the last several years, I've asked hundreds of small church attendees why they attend a small church. And there are 2 reasons that rise to the top that are mentioned by almost every one of them. Reason number 1 is always some version of, I go to a small church because the pastor knows my name. There's like this whole segment of the church, like about half of the church that goes to small churches, that have this weird idea that they want to be pastored by their pastor. Right? And it matters to them that the person who's the main lead pastor who preaches on Sunday morning is the person who's going to visit me when I'm sick, who is the person who I can call when we've got a crisis in the family, is the person who's going to perform the funeral for my parent after they pass. Now, fully half the body of Christ, that doesn't matter to them. They're getting pastored in a small group or on a ministry team or by a staff pastor. As long as you're being pastored, that's fine. But there's a large group that like the idea that I'm being pastored by my pastor, and only in the small church can that happen. The second primary reason people say they go to a small church is because they can make a difference there in a way that they can't make a difference at a big church. So if you have, if you can play the guitar moderately well, for instance, you're not getting on stage at a mega church. You shouldn't. It doesn't fit the context. But if you go to a church of 50 and you play the guitar moderately well, dude, you're leading in worship in a month. Like, right. And then because you're doing it, because you're going to be on the platform every week, because you're leading other people in worship, it inspires you to get better at your guitar, get better at worship, get closer to Jesus. This on-the-job training, that this is one of the great things that the small church provides, is on-the-job training in ways that the big church can't. By the time you get on stage at a big church, or by the time you're overseeing a department at a big church, you have had years of training to get there. You are now a professional. But how do they get trained to do that? Almost all of it happens in small churches.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is going to be kind of a, I don't know, maybe a simple question, but I feel like I need to ask it just for the sake of the story, which is,
sure.
Is it ever the fault of a church's size that makes it not the kind of church, not a healthy church? Like, is it can a church be too big or too small, and that be the reason, the fundamental core of the problem with a church, the thing that is contributing to an unhealthy environment?
I don't think size is ever the reason for ill health in a church, whether too big or too small. I don't think there's such a thing as too big. I don't think there's such a big thing as too small. But if we don't understand size dynamic, and if you're not pastoring a church well according to the size that it is, then the size becomes a contributing factor to the health, not because that size is wrong, but because you're not understanding the dynamic of that particular size. Which is why, because people ask me, if size doesn't matter, why do you write so much? I may got 5 books over my shoulder here about church size, right? And yet I say, church size has nothing to do with health. Then why are you writing about it? Because I primarily talk to pastors, and one of the principles that is not taught to pastors as much as it should be is size dynamics, that you pastor a church of 50 very differently than a church of 200 and very differently than a church of 1,000. Neither one is better than the other, but you got to understand it. And also there are people whose skill sets match the small church leadership skills needed. And there are other people whose skill sets, they couldn't pastor a small church for very long because their skill set is all about team management and organizational structure that suits a big church. Right. So I've got megachurch friends who every once in a while will tell me, I admire what you do. I appreciate what you do. And I have such an admiration for small church pastors because I could never do what they do. It would drive me crazy. And they're not being condescending when they say that. They're not just patting my back. They really mean it. And almost every time when I press them on it, what is it that drives you nuts? It's almost always this. As a big megachurch pastor, what they'll say is, when I need something done, I need something done. I can't handle the small church dynamic of, okay, we're going to have a meeting about how to do this. But before we have the meeting, we got to have the pre-meeting. And some of the people in the pre-meeting aren't going to be in the main meeting. But if you don't get approval from the people in the pre-meeting, then you're not going to be able to get approval from the people who are officially in the meeting. And then after you have the meeting, you got to have the parking lot meeting after the meeting. And if you aren't in on that conversation to see where that's going to go, the parking lot meeting after the meeting can kill all the good stuff that you did in the meeting. And small church pastors have figured out how to work with all those moving relational parts and figure out how to massage all of that and figure out how to get something done in the middle of all that relational mess, where a big church pastor goes, I want to pay somebody so that they have to do what I tell them. Right? Right. So and each of those is a different skill set. That relational skill set of trying to figure out how this move is going to affect that relationship over there, which is now going to tweak this relationship over here, which is now going to tweak my ability to raise funds over here. That is not a lesser skill set. That is a very complex skill set that people have to learn and can hone over years of pastoring in a small church. So nobody's ever going to convince me that someone who can do that is less of a leader than someone who can tell people that they're paying to do what they're told to do.
Yeah. And how can, because I think most of our audience, we have a multi-religious audience, but we have a pretty strong Christian audience. And I think most of our audience who are Christians are not pastors, they're congregants. How do we as lay people in the church, hold our leaders accountable and make sure that we're asking the questions that we need to be asking about whether or not the church is healthy based on, and how the size is playing into that or not playing into that?
Yeah, this is one of the advantages of the healthy small church, and word healthy has to be in this, is that in a healthy small church, happens more automatically. My podcast is called The Church Lobby. And the reason I named it The Church Lobby is because the smaller the church is, the more important lobby ministry becomes, right? In the big church, you might never ever see the lead pastor in the lobby because there's just too many people and they've got to take a rest between multiple services, and all of their connective tissue between the lead pastor and the congregant is going to be through the Sunday morning sermon where you're watching them on stage. But the smaller the church is, the less important that becomes, and the more important hanging out with people in the church lobby becomes. So that's part of the skill set that the small church pastor needs to learn. And one of the advantages of it is, again, in a healthy small church, because there are a lot of dysfunctional, unhealthy small churches where the pastor is a little general who just runs their own little kingdom. And that's just like there are big churches where they've got a bigger kingdom, but they're running it. Okay. So it's got nothing to do. So this control issue and this dictatorial pastor mindset has no bearing on size. But in a healthy, smaller church, accountability happens when you're walking through the church lobby, or you see the pastor in a store, or you are on the baseball team with the pastor on Friday nights, and you get to see their behavior off pulpit, right? And at that point, because you're closer to them and because you know them and because you have regular conversations with them and because you're in their house and they're in your house on a regular basis, you can call them on their garbage. You can go, hey, that's not right. I don't like the way you're going there. You're acting a little more arrogant there, Pastor. I love you, but I got to tell you, this is not, you're working too hard. Can I take some of that pressure off of you? But the average congregant in a megachurch never has an opportunity to have that conversation with the pastor. So in a big church, the pastor needs to be much more purposeful about having a handful of people around them to whom they will be held accountable and who can speak like that into their lives. But in a healthy small church, it comes a little more automatically, and it can come from the average congregant far more often.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. And we covered most of what I wanted to get through, but I'll just end with this, which is, I really think, the core of a lot of what you're talking about, which is how do we still support the growing of God's kingdom, the growing of our own individual churches? How do we still really radically support that? I believe that's very important, but not obsess over the numbers.
One of the chapters in the last third of the book here, Desizing the Church Over My Shoulder, is entitled Discipleship Fixes Everything. So I actually, one of the things I love about writing a book is you can write something down, and if it's stupid, you just don't hit publish, So I wrote that down, and then I looked at it and went, is that the stupidest thing I ever wrote, or is that one of the best things I ever wrote? And it turns out that's actually one of the best things. I didn't know I believed it until I wrote it, But think about it. Can you think of a problem in a church that discipleship won't fix? Financial problem, discipleship will fix that. Lack of evangelism, discipleship will fix that. Lack of accountability or immorality, discipleship will fix those. Right? It's almost like that was Jesus' idea, right? Disciples. So that's what we're looking for when we're talking about moving the church forward, when we're talking about what does the church really need, when we're talking about what should we be concentrating on instead of numbers, what are ways that we can understand whether or not a church is moving forward, even if it's staying static numerically. Ask yourself, are we discipling people who become disciple makers? And so, for instance, one of the reasons I mentioned to you already, one of the reasons our church hasn't grown beyond what I call its shoe size. We have a shoe size that lands somewhere between 150 to 220. And we've been between those two parameters for 15 to 20 years. And that's not intentional. Nobody's trying to keep it there. But between a whole bunch of factors, from the size of our facility to the leadership skills and gifts of the people who are there, That just seems to be where it lands. But what we've discovered is at that size, we are ideally sized to train people up and to send them out. And so that one couple that I mentioned, earlier, that was just 10 days ago, but that happens monthly. There's people who do it prominently enough that about monthly we have them on stage and we pray for them and send them off. But that happens multiple times a month where we lose people, not because they're upset, not because they've fallen away from the faith, although all of that happens in our church too. But there are more than one a month on a regular basis out of a church of 190, 100, 200 or so right now that we are sending off to do ministry because we've discipled them and we're sending them off into the harvest field. So our congregation isn't growing numerically, but our contribution to the kingdom of God is way bigger than our footprint.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I really appreciate that. Well, I think that's all I need from you. So thank you so much. Really very, very helpful.
You're welcome. Good to be with you. Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a wonderful rest of your day.